I remember the exact moment everything changed. 1 second, I was a supervisor in the juvenile court system, just outside Seattle, certain that I'd be doing this job well into old age. The next second, I was in a hospital bed, teetering on the edge of death, surrounded by frantic voices and the relentless beeping of machines. The strangest part? Even in the midst of that chaos, I felt an odd sense of calm. It was as if a deep intuition told me, "You're closer to the end than you think, and that's all right." 4 years, I had supervised teenage probation cases in King County, helping kids who'd lost their way. I loved my job, often telling people, "I'll do this until the day I die." It was a half-joking expression of my devotion, but I never imagined those words would come so close to reality. Back then, I had no inkling that an ordinary Friday afternoon in May 2006 would lead me not just to the hospital, but, if my memory is to be believed, straight into the presence of God. I grew up believing everyone deserves a second chance, a perspective rooted in the same faith I saw modeled by my parents. After college, I gravitated toward community work with youth. It wasn't a lucrative career, but it was deeply fulfilling. Every day at the juvenile courts, I spoke with young people who had made mistakes and gotten tangled up in bad decisions. My job was to figure out how to guide them toward a more hopeful path, whether through rehabilitation programs, mentorships, or close supervision. I treated my role like a mission, not just a paycheck. Parents, and even some of the teens themselves, used to thank me for going the extra mile. They'd say, "You don't have to care this much," or, "Why do you believe in us so strongly?" I'd smile and tell them, "Because I know what it's like to need grace." Over time, I began to see that grace was woven into every part of life. Friends giving you a hand, a boss who sees your potential despite your mistakes, a stranger who offers kindness for no reason. I believed God Himself was the source of that grace. Little did I know I would soon rely on divine grace to save my own life. May 5, 2006, started off like any ordinary day. I woke up, fed my dog, and got ready for work. Around mid-morning, I felt a twinge in my right side. Immediately, I recognized the ache of a kidney stone. I'd had them before, and though they're notoriously painful, I assumed I'd survive this one the way I survived the others. For a few hours, I tried to power through the pain, waiting for the stone to pass. But it only grew worse. By early afternoon, I realized no amount of hydration or gritting my teeth would help. I decided to go to the emergency room. I can still recall the look on the receptionist's face as I casually told her, "I'm pretty sure I've got a kidney stone stuck on my right side." To me, it was old news. They'd give me N4, some morphine, and keep me overnight if necessary. I'd be back at work in a day or two. Once inside, the doctors ran tests and found I also had a kidney infection. "No problem," they said. "We'll start you on antibiotics, break up the stone, and you'll be good to go." As they explained the procedure, I felt a wave of relief. Morphine dulled the pain, and I dozed off, thinking I was in good hands. What none of us realized was that the particular antibiotic I received wasn't effective against the strain of infection I had. When they shattered the stone, the bacteria spread rapidly into my bloodstream. Within hours, my vitals plummeted. Organs began shutting down. Heart, lungs, kidneys. My body slipped into septic shock. Suddenly, the calm confidence of the doctors turned to alarm. Machines beeped in frantic discord, and multiple specialists converged on my room. I remember hearing urgent whispers, something about my heart rate dropping, something about the infection not responding. After that, everything grew hazy. Then it happened. I heard a long, droning beep, a sound I knew too well from TV shows but never expected to hear for myself. It was the sound of a flatline. According to hospital records, medical staff tried to revive me. They administered more medication, attempted CPR, and used a defibrillator. Despite their efforts, I was declared clinically dead for approximately 1 hour and 45 minutes. I wish I could describe the transition from life to whatever came next in a more dramatic way. But in truth, it felt sudden and quiet. One moment, I was aware of the beeping machines and the blurred faces of nurses. The next, I was floating, yes, floating, above the hospital bed. I saw my own body, limp and pale, surrounded by frantic doctors. Instead of fear, I felt a strange detachment. Almost like I was observing a scene in a movie, except I recognized the main character as me. In a flash, the hospital room started to shrink. I had no control over what was happening. It was as if a force gently yet irresistibly pulled me upward. I soared through the ceilings and floors, the building structure becoming translucent, passing me by in an instant. It was shockingly fast but also peaceful. Then came darkness, a sort of vast expanse, and almost immediately after, light. When I say light, I don't mean the harsh glare of a bright flashlight. This was a radiance that felt alive and comforting, surrounding me from every angle. It enveloped me like a warm blanket, stripping away the last remnants of anxiety. I'd always heard people talk about a tunnel in near-death experiences, but for me, it felt more like stepping through a doorway. One moment, I was in the darkness. The next, I entered a place that seemed to hum with life and color. The very first thing I noticed was that every color, green, blue, yellow, had a depth I'd never seen on Earth. It was as if each hue glowed from within. Even the air felt substantial, like I could touch it. And the sense of peace? Indescribable. It wasn't just my mind that was calm. My entire being resonated with a stillness that made every earthly concern vanish. In those first few seconds, I remember thinking, this must be heaven. It has to be. I can't say I moved in the conventional sense. Rather, I was guided. Ahead was what looked like a lush forest, its trees tall and majestic. I had a profound longing to see Jesus, as if some internal compass directed me to him. As I approached, the trees literally parted, moving aside without any physical force, almost like a red carpet rolling out. It felt as though the forest was welcoming me, whispering in its own language, "He's going to see the king." Stepping through the last line of trees, I entered a clearing so vast I couldn't see where it ended. Off to one side, surrounded by a multitude of what I instinctively knew were angels and redeemed souls, stood Jesus. There was no doubt in my mind. It was him. The love emanating from that single figure was so overwhelming it nearly buckled my knees. The intensity of that love dissolved every shred of self-consciousness, leaving only reverence. I dropped to my hands and knees, not out of fear but out of a desire to honor him. It felt natural, like my soul had been yearning for this moment my entire life. Even with my eyes lowered, I perceived the light that radiated from him. It wasn't blinding, it was comforting, enveloping, and deeply personal, like a warm tide washing over every cell in my being. I lifted my gaze just enough to see his feet and the hem of his robe, and even those radiated unconditional acceptance. My mind buzzed with a single realization: you did this for me. It was a statement, a prayer, and a confession all at once. I understood, in a way words can't do justice, that his sacrifice on earth and the beauty of this heavenly realm were all part of the same love. Slowly, I raised my eyes. What I saw in his face was a kind of joy and tenderness beyond human description. He didn't speak with his mouth. At least, I didn't see his lips move. But I heard him in my spirit. It felt like he was downloading knowledge straight into me. In a matter of seconds, I grasped complexities about love, forgiveness, and eternity that I could never have learned in a lifetime of reading. Some of it has stayed with me, some faded when I returned to earth. But the essence of it was clear. God's love is immeasurably greater than any sin or shortcoming. And heaven is more real than earth itself. After a moment that could have been an instant or an eternity, I noticed a group of people standing at a distance behind Jesus. At the front was my beloved grandmother Sarah, who'd passed away when I was in college. She looked radiant, full of life, free from the physical ailments that had marked her final years. Behind her stood others I recognized, uncles, aunts, more distant relatives. And behind them, generations of ancestors I'd never met. They all glowed with a joy that rivaled the sunlight around us. I remember Grandmother Sarah stepping forward, smiling with a warmth that made my heart leap. I expected her to scold me for taking so long to show up, the way she would when I visited her late on a Sunday afternoon. But in heaven, there was no trace of sarcasm or annoyance, only pure gladness. "Telepathically or spiritually, words fail here," she said. "We're so happy you're here. But remember what matters. Bring as many of us back with you as you can." At first, I didn't comprehend. Back to Earth? I scanned the horizon, noticing so many who looked familiar, and many who didn't. Some were people I never would have expected to see in heaven. They didn't match my human ideas of who qualifies. But there they were, joyful and embraced by divine mercy. I felt a jolt of realization. God's grace is far more expansive than I'd ever allowed myself to believe. My assumptions about who might or might not deserve heaven suddenly seemed laughably limited. No sooner had that realization sunk in than I felt Jesus' gaze intensify. An awareness filled me. "It's not your time." Instantly, my heart sank. Leaving heaven wasn't just leaving a place. It felt like tearing myself away from the ultimate source of love. I wanted to protest, to beg Jesus to let me stay. But there was a gentle authority in his voice. I somehow understood that staying wasn't an option. I still had a mission on earth. As I prepared to exit, Jesus impressed upon me a sense of purpose, like a soldier receiving orders. At the same time, the landscape itself seemed to shift, and I found myself back at the boundary where I'd first arrived. I hesitated, overwhelmed by sadness at the thought of returning to a broken, pain-filled world. But heaven's peace left no room for despair. It was more like I was leaving one room to enter another. Suddenly, my perspective changed. I was hovering above my hospital bed, staring down at a lifeless figure, me. Various instruments lay scattered around, and I noticed the medical staff had switched off some machines, believing the fight was over. A doctor was in the process of signing paperwork. All the while, I felt suspended in a quiet space. Then, in a rush of sound and light, I slammed back into my body. The first thing I remember was the beep of a heart monitor. Nurses shouted in surprise, and there was a flurry of activity as they scrambled to intubate me, reattach leads, and recheck vitals. My chest ached, my throat felt raw, and my head pounded like I'd just awakened from the deepest sleep. But the biggest shock was the contrast. Moments earlier, I had been bathed in the sublime light of heaven. Now I was in a place of fluorescent bulbs and panicked voices. In those early hours of recovery, I drifted between hazy consciousness and sedation. When I was coherent enough to speak, the medical team bombarded me with questions, trying to piece together how my body had restarted after nearly 2 hours. From the corner of my eye, I saw one nurse wiping tears from her cheeks. Another nurse held my hand, whispering something about miracles. I felt too weak to explain my experience in detail, but I managed to rasp out a few words. "I saw him." Over the next few days, the infection receded, and my vitals normalized. The doctors called it remarkable and against the odds. I called it grace. Word spread to a few family members, and soon my hospital room was filled with flowers and hushed visitors. My cousin asked, "What did you see?" I tried telling her, but halfway through describing the colors of heaven, I broke down sobbing. Not tears of trauma, but tears of longing. I missed that realm so intensely. Yet, I also felt a seed of resolve planting itself in my heart. There was a reason I was sent back. Once I was discharged, I entered a phase of intense reflection. I'd sit on my porch, watching the sun set over the Seattle skyline, and recall how time didn't exist in heaven, how I'd felt more alive in those timeless moments than in all my years on earth. Grandmother Sarah's words echoed in my mind, "Bring as many of us back with you as you can." At first, I struggled to interpret that. Did it mean converting people? Handing out Bibles on street corners? That didn't feel right. Over time, I realized it was simpler and deeper. Love them. Show them grace. Reflect the compassion and acceptance I had experienced when I was in heaven. Of course, I believe in the importance of Jesus' sacrifice and the necessity of faith, but this was also about adopting heaven's posture of open arms. If God's grace can surprise me by including folks I never imagined in heaven, then I needed to dismantle my own walls of judgment and love people more authentically. I returned to my job at the juvenile courts, but I was different. My patience grew, my empathy deepened, and my sense of purpose sharpened. The same kids who used to push my buttons now saw a calmer, kinder version of me. I began sharing parts of my story, not the entire detailed near-death account, but enough to let them know I believed in second chances because I had personally experienced the ultimate one. A few months later, a local pastor invited me to speak at his church. My first instinct was to decline, thinking, I'm not a preacher. I'm just a regular guy. But I recalled how Jesus had commanded me to return for a reason. So I agreed, trembling with nervousness. Standing at the podium that Sunday morning, I recounted the broad strokes of my medical crisis, the sense of traveling beyond, and the unconditional love I felt. I described the mission to love and the presence of family members I'd recognized in heaven. After the service, a young mother approached me, tears in her eyes. She said, "My son died 2 years ago, and I've struggled with anger toward God ever since. Hearing that heaven is real and love is so tangible, it gives me hope." That conversation sealed my resolve. If sharing my experience could ease even a single person's pain, it was worth every ounce of vulnerability. In the months and years that followed, I noticed changes in my day-to-day life. My fear of death completely vanished. The finality we associate with dying no longer haunted me. I also became less fixated on material success. The wealth and prestige that our world values so highly felt shallow compared to the treasure I'd momentarily tasted on the other side. I won't pretend that I became some perfect saint. I still faced frustrations, made mistakes, and had moments of doubt. Yet, deep down, an unwavering certainty anchored me. Heaven is real, God's love is beyond comprehension, and we're here on earth for a purpose that extends beyond ourselves. That conviction changed everything. From how I approached disagreements with friends, to how I spent my money, to how I viewed societal issues. I also engaged with skeptics, some of whom argued my vision was merely a hallucination caused by oxygen deprivation or the mix of drugs in my system. While I respect science, I can only share what I experienced. A realm more vivid than this one, a love so palpable it leaves no space for fear, and a clarity of mind that was anything but foggy. As I often say, whether someone believes me isn't my main concern. My hope is that, if they sense even a spark of possibility, they'll explore that spark until it illuminates their life. Now, years later, I continue to tell my story. Not because I want fame or attention, but because I can't stay silent about something that changed me so profoundly. When I think back to lying in that hospital bed, clinically gone for nearly 2 hours, I'm reminded that life can be fleeting. You can feel perfectly healthy one day and find yourself on death's doorstep the next. But here's the good news. Death isn't the end. It's a threshold. On the other side is a love so all-encompassing that it redefines what we think of as reality. I used to believe that wholeheartedly based on faith. Now, I believe it based on lived experience. If there's one takeaway, it's that love, pure, selfless, divine love, is the very heartbeat of existence. It's the reason Jesus welcomed me so warmly. It's the reason my grandmother glowed with joy. It's the reason I was sent back with a mission. That mission, at its core, is about embracing people, being present, listening without judgment, sharing hope whenever possible. Even in the juvenile courts, where I still sometimes volunteer, I see each young person as a soul cherished by heaven. Knowing that shapes how I respond to their mistakes. My job isn't to condemn, but to guide them toward the light that once guided me. And so I invite you, if you find any spark of interest in this story, if something inside you says, "Could this be true?" Don't ignore that nudge. Seek answers. Open your heart. Watch how your attitude changes when you treat life as if heaven is real. You might be surprised at the peace, joy, and purpose it brings. I can't guarantee everyone a vivid vision of heaven, But I believe we can all experience glimpses of its love right here, right now, through faith, compassion, and connection. It's my hope that by sharing my story, you'll be inspired to love more boldly, forgive more readily, and live each day with eternity in mind. Because, as I've learned firsthand, the veil between this world and the next is thinner than we think. Thank you for listening to my experience. If this journey resonates with you, please remember to subscribe. Join our growing community of seekers and believers who yearn for the truth that goes beyond what our eyes can see. Give this video a like, and share it with friends or family who might be searching for hope. Let's continue spreading a message of grace, compassion, and faith, so that each person might discover a peace that surpasses all understanding.